Hi everyone, Jack Diamond here, and today's tutorial is on creating the proper export settings from Adobe Premiere. I've seen a lot of videos where people claim to have the proper export settings, and really all they're doing is going into the export settings window and choosing a YouTube export preset. Well, I'm here to show you today that there's a better way to do that, that you can actually set your settings right and make sure that you have the proper export settings so your video is in the highest quality possible. And that's what this is all about. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you have the proper sequence selected. Adobe Premiere allows you to open up multiple sequences at a time. So if you're going to export the proper one, you want to make sure that you have it selected. Here's the sequence that I'm going to export. It's called Workflow. And the first thing I just want you to make note of is the fact that I have the work area of this sequence set to some small part of the clip here, not the entire video, and that's okay, but just be aware of it because I want to show you what that does later on. Also, I want to show you that I don't have this clip completely rendered. I guess I should zoom out instead of zooming in. I don't have this clip entirely rendered. I still have this red bar across the top. That's okay. You don't have to render your entire clip before you export it, contrary to what other people tell you. This will actually save you a lot of time because you don't have to render in order to export. And finally, before you open the export settings, I want you to look at the sequence settings. This step isn't necessary, but I just want you to be aware of it. When you click on sequence and sequence settings, Adobe is going to show you some of the settings that you actually have used when you created this sequence. So for example, it's kind of hard to see here, but you're working in 1920 by 1080 resolution. That's full HD resolution, so it's important that our export is also in 1920 by 1080. We're also working in 23.976 frames per second. So that's our time base. These are not settings you can change after the fact. Once you've set up your sequence, they kind of stay. So it's important to set up your sequence right from the beginning. And if you don't know how to do that, check out my other tutorial on workflow, and that'll show you how to fix that. But at this stage, it's just important that you take note of these settings. Also take a look at audio. 48 kilohertz is what we're working in here. That might not be the default for the preset that you actually choose, so just be aware of these numbers. So again, make sure you have the sequence that you want to export selected and choose File, Export, Media. You can also use Control-M to access this same menu, whichever you prefer. And here is your export settings window. The first thing I want you to note is that down here, if I hover over this, you can see the duration of the output file is actually 2 seconds and 0 frames. Well, I know my final clip should be longer than 2 seconds, but that's because it's displaying the duration for the work area, and by default it's going to only export the work area. So what you want to do is change your source range to entire sequence. So this will include all the black at the beginning, all the black at the end, and whatever you've put in between. So make sure your sequence is entirely trimmed to what you want. And now you can see I've got 49 seconds and 14 frames, which is exactly the length of the sequence that I've been working with. So that's what I'm going to export. The other thing you probably want to do is change this to output up here, just so that you can actually see what the final output clip is. If you've applied any complicated effects, it's possible that when you have this on source, you won't see the final rendered version here. It will still export, but you won't see it here. So it's important to change this to output just so that you know what you're looking at. If you like, at this point, you can click around in the timeline just to make sure everything is still good. If you click on a part that's not rendered, it might take a second to actually render that frame, but that's okay. I know that this sequence is perfect for what I want to export, so I'm ready to actually go up to the export settings. I'm going to be using H.264 export format. That's sort of today's modern export preferred format, and YouTube actually recommends using H.264 for this. But here's what they don't recommend, and that's choosing the drop-down preset here and going down to YouTube Widescreen HD. A lot of people on the internet I've seen do this because it's quick and easy there. It's one step. The only problem is, if you look here, it's now going to export at 1280 by 720 at 24 frames per second. It's going to export with audio at 44.1 kilohertz. And we know, because we just checked before we went into these export settings that that's entirely wrong. In fact, it does show you again here, our source, our sequence, which is called workflow, is at 1920 by 1080, and it's at 23.976, which is an important distinction here. It's not 24. You want to make sure you use the right time base. Also, our audio is at 48 kilohertz, not 44.1 kilohertz. So why would we use this preset? I don't know, but I've seen a lot of people actually use it. So let's go ahead and create our own preset that you can use for all of your exports from now on. Then it'll be really fast. Now you can go ahead and just start modifying these numbers directly, but it's probably easier to pick another preset that we can actually modify and only make subtle changes to. So I'm going to choose this HD 1080p 24 high quality preset and go from there. So if we look at the settings now, we've got 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second, 48 kilohertz audio, and now we're a lot closer to what we need to. It's really this 24 and 23.976 is the main thing that we need to concern ourselves with. So we'll deal with that when we get there, but the first thing I want to do is just make sure that we've set our output properties. Let's work from sort of top to bottom here. So output name, if we click on that, it'll allow us to choose where we want to export and what the actual name of our file is. So I'll just choose this export directory here, which is where I want to export my final clip. And I'm going to type a new name, and I'm just going to call it Final Video 01. And you'll notice I don't have to add the .mp4 extension. It will do that for me. I could click save, or I can just push enter on the keyboard, which is what I prefer because it's faster. And there it is, final_video01.mp4, ready to export, except that I haven't set up my settings. So let's do that. Want to make sure we have export video and export audio selected, assuming that you do want to actually export both. And then we're going to go down here. You can kind of ignore these filters and the multiplexer because they're usually just generally set to standard settings. Where we want to mess around is in the video and the audio settings. And even the audio probably going to be set already. Here they've got the audio set to AAC, version 1, stereo, 48 kilohertz, and high quality. And you can change the bitrate if you want to, but really 128 kilobits per second is good for your audio. Let's spend a little bit of time looking at the video settings. This is where we want to make the biggest change here. So here, we're working in NTSC video, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels, and we don't have to make a change there because we know that's exactly the right size we want to work with. Scroll down a little bit here. Frame rate, which is our frames per second, 24 frames per second. Well, that's wrong, so we need to change this to 23.976 frames per second. That's just matching my sequence. I'm not saying this is going to be right for every edit you do. I just happen to shoot my footage in 1920 by 1080 at 23.976, and I use that as my workflow carry through. So if you look at my previous video on workflow, you'll see how I got those sequence settings. But if you have a different sequence settings, don't worry, just make sure that you select the right settings here. And you can find that here because it does show you what your sequence workflow should be, or what your sequence clip should be for frame rate. Aspect ratio 16:9 should stay the same. Profile main level 4.2. Here's a couple settings that you might not be aware of. Rendering at maximum depth. This does say it improves render quality, but it does take your render speed down. Now I've done some Google searching and some checking myself. If you have a really good video card, and specifically something NVIDIA with CUDA background, this setting is actually going to take away from your render quality, and it will actually sacrifice time as well. So you're not actually gaining anything by checking it. So be aware that when you see a setting that says render at maximum depth or render at maximum quality, you may be inclined to select it, but understand what it means first. Look it up. I usually do not select this. The next thing you want to look at is bitrate settings. And I've seen a lot of debate as to what the proper bitrate settings should be and what the encoding settings should be and things like that. This is generally something you want to play with a little bit. Try exporting at some bit rates and some other bit rates and just see what it looks like. If you want to know my settings, first of all, I'm going to change this to VBR 2-pass. Basically, CBR is constant bit rate, so it only takes one number and it just encodes every frame with a certain amount of data capability. And if there's too much data, well, it just drops it. So you actually end up with a sacrifice if you use CBR. VBR is a little bit better. It goes through and it sort of says, this is the average data rate that I want, and if it goes a little bit higher, or if I need a little bit more, I will add some in, and if I have a little bit to spare, I'll sort of keep it in reserve. One pass basically only goes one time through the footage, looking at all the footage and figuring out what the optimum bit rate should be, whereas 2pass actually scans the footage entirely and then goes back and starts doing this encoding. So you actually end up with a better quality at the end. So I always choose VBR 2pass. It does take a little bit longer to export, but that's not really an issue for most people, because they'll export overnight or they'll export in a time when they're not busy. The next thing is, what are your target bit rate and what are your maximum bit rate? I typically use my maximum bit rate up to about 40. No real reason for that. It's a very high quality setting, and it basically says I'm going to allow my data rate to go as high as 40 if it needs to. But what is my target bit rate? That is, what is the average bit rate? This setting is actually really important. And if you actually go to YouTube's website, you can find some advanced settings, and I'll show you that right now. So there's a page on YouTube's help called Advanced Encoding Settings, and there's a lot of stuff here that talks about what they like and what they don't like, what your frame rate should be. But here's the important bit. It's bit rates. And so they tell you for standard quality and for high quality, what do you think your bit rate should be? And we're working at 1080p, so 1920 by 1080. 1080 refers to the amount of vertical lines that you have in your footage. They say that a video bit rate of 8,000 kilobits per second, that is 8 megabits per second, is sufficient for standard quality. They also say that up to 50 kilobits per second is basically really good if you have a high quality internet connection and you want to use that. So the numbers basically to think about are 8 and 50, and if we go down here back to Premiere, this is where we dial those numbers in. So again, I don't use 50, I use 40. No real reason, it's just something I've always used. But here's the important one, and this is where your file size is really going to change. So you can think about this as average bit rate. So it's going to use approximately, in this case 32, but we can set that all the way down to 8, and you can actually just type that in. 8, oops, not 88. Yeah, set that to whatever you want. 8 is what YouTube recommends for standard quality. I actually usually go a little bit higher. I usually go 10. And again, there's a lot of debate as far as what you can use, but just try it. Just see what you like. If you've got a short clip and you don't mind spending a little bit more time rendering and having a slightly larger file, because that's basically what this means, is how big is your file going to be, then feel free to experiment with these numbers. They do also give you an estimated file size down here, depending on what you set for these numbers here, but I'm going to be honest with you, this estimated file size is generally really wrong, so don't worry about it. A couple checkboxes you don't want to select are use previews, because usually when you have rendered segments, you're rendering at a lower quality than your final output, so you don't want to use those low quality previews in your final render. So make sure you don't have that checked. Frame blending is a feature that was introduced in Adobe After Effects. Anything where there's speed changes, there's this thing called frame blending, which will try to interpolate between frames. Usually it's for slow motion. It'll basically build frames between frames, and it can give you really good results, or it can give you really bad results. If you're not using any time changes in your clip, it's completely irrelevant. If you are, you're really going to want to test that and see what the difference is between using it and not using it. So I wouldn't recommend using it. And finally, this render at maximum quality, use maximum render quality. This is the same as that other setting that I showed you. Really pay attention, really Google this if you want to know more about it, but I do not recommend using this checkbox if you have a really high quality graphics card, or really any graphics card that supports CUDA. NVIDIA's graphic cards, that support CUDA, because they will actually it will actually slow down your render if you use this with no appreciable render quality. You won't get any better quality out of this. It basically, what it does is just forces kind of an overscan. but I wouldn't worry about it. So I think that's pretty much all we need to set. We're basically ready to do our export. The last step that I would always recommend is come on up here and save the preset. So just by clicking this little button, you can actually call this, my export settings. Now you want to make some customizations here. So you want to make sure that you know it's at 1080p, and you want to make sure it's at 23.976 frames per second if that's the settings that you use. And the main reason is because if you suddenly start shooting in 29.97 frames per second, you can't use this export. So you'll have to go in and change that again and maybe create a new export preset. But for now, my workflow really it stays at 1080p and 23.976. So I'm going to always use this export preset. And there it is. And now it appears at the top of the list here, my export settings. All those settings change, so you never have to worry about setting it again. And basically the last thing you want to do is choose between the Q and the export. I always choose Q, and I'll tell you why. If you choose export, your clip starts exporting immediately. The only problem is it's tying up Adobe Premiere to actually render your clip. I like to click Q and send it to a third-party piece of software which will actually do the render, which frees up Adobe Premiere. Then you can actually do more editing if you want while your clip is exporting and you're not actually tying up your system. The other thing that's nice is you can actually set up 20 or 30 different clips if you want to, and then tell it, okay, now start rendering, and you can walk away and let it just do all the rendering. So as I said, I like to click Q, and I'll show you what that does. Basically, it exports data to something called Adobe Media Encoder. And I said third party, but it's actually, I guess, not third party because it's made by Adobe, but it's not integrated into Premiere. And that's all I really meant by third party. So you get this window. Well, not this window. So you get this window. And there it is. My clip is H.264. All my export setting preset has been chosen here. You can see it's all right. And my output file is here, and basically it's just going to sit there and wait. The nice thing is Adobe Premiere is free, so I could go back to Premiere if I wanted to. I could set up another clip to export. I could keep editing, whatever, because it's not actually rendering at this point. When I am ready to render, I basically just click the little play button, and off it goes. It's now going to start rendering, and now it's going to use basically all the processors that I have in my system and things like that. So everything's going to start to slow down at this point. But this is a good thing that you can set up a bunch of clips, render them overnight, and then you're good. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. I hope you gained some valuable insight on how to create your own export preset, and good luck now and in the future.
If you'd like to see more behind-the-scenes videos or visual effects tutorials, consider subscribing to this channel. You can also leave a comment below telling me exactly what type of video you'd like to see. If you want to help me out, you can like this video or share it on your favorite social media sites. You can even follow me on Twitter. Thanks for watching. I'm Jack Diamond, and I'll see you next time.